For the Clarity Crew, I'm Gebhards. So you're thinking about leaving your church. I want to help you today to make sure that God Himself is active in the decision process and tell you how to do that as you consider transitioning from a certain church that you're at to a different church. Well, it was several years ago when I was newly married that I made a mistake. I was anticipating our anniversary, had purchased for my wife a few different gifts, but the primary gifts were a set of pans. And so she opened a few of the other gifts that were small and appreciated those. But when she opened the pans, pots and pans, she was not so pleased because when I purchased those for her as a surprise, she was not a part of the decision-making process. You see, she does most of the cooking. And she didn't want those pans, which was her prerogative. So we simply returned those and she did something fun with the money. But when you're making a decision about church, that's a significant decision, I want you to know how to involve God in that process. Well, a couple things before we move any further. Number one, I'm a senior pastor. So people transition away from the church that I'm a part of and people transition into the church that I'm a part of. It's a normal part of church. And so I offer this to you as a public service announcement in a spirit of love, not in any way aiming at anybody, but simply trying to help people because I know a lot of people are thinking about this. And number two, when we're talking about transitioning from churches, I'm not talking about a situation where there's black and white error, theological error based on scripture, or black and white sin, meaning clear-cut overt sin. In either of those cases, just leave. And leave in a way that honors the Lord, but leave. And if you have to be clear, but leave. I'm talking about transitions in ways that are not so black and white or clear-cut, maybe ways that involve our preferences or different philosophical styles, etc. So let's talk about those. How can you honor God in transitioning from your church in the process of that? Number one, prioritize what's important to Him and lay aside your preferences. I want to challenge you to write out from the scriptures a clear-cut biblical theology of the church. What is important to God in the church? What does He say is important? Because He put it here in the Bible. What we'll find is, however, the things that are upsetting us are not normally on that list. It could be this Bible teacher that has this thing versus that. It could be this structure instead of that structure. It could be that there's small groups that have this instead of that. I mean, my point is there's so many preferences over here that actually come in and drive wedges of disunity when they should be laid aside. 1 Corinthians 9 tells us that the path of the Christian walk is laying aside our rights so that God can be honored in unity. So prioritize what's important to Him and lay aside your preferences, number one. Number two, cultivate followership instead of criticizing leaders. Cultivate your own personal followership and recognize that God tells you how to follow well instead of simply criticizing leaders. Again, it's easy for us to criticize a preacher for saying it a certain way or having a certain style, etc. But instead of that, God's not going to hold you accountable for those items. He's going to hold you accountable for how you followed. And there are 6 or 7 New Testament passages that tell us how to follow. Maybe the primary one is Hebrews 13:17. And as you consider leaving your church, how are you obeying these exact words? It says this: submit to your leaders and obey them, for they're keeping watch over your soul as those who will give an account. Your leaders will give an account over your soul. By all means, submit to them and obey them. That's hard to do. What does that look like? As you have these difficulties, or you have these questions, or you have these doubts, or things are unclear to you, constantly be bringing them to your leaders, your elders, and your pastors, and asking them for help. And it very well may be that you simply just have a disagreement, and in a spirit of charity, they may lead you to find another church that aligns with your philosophy or how you're learning, and that's okay too. My point is this: focus on your followership instead of criticizing the leadership of others. And number three, I'm encouraging you to allow the gospel principle of mercy triumphing over justice to be a way that you would consider leaving. Leave in a spirit of grace instead of in a spirit that would promote maybe what's justice or what you feel is just, or maybe that would lead to division. Ephesians 4:3 says this: be eager to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. Talks about the humility and gentleness and patience that we have for one another, bearing with one another in love in verse 2. All of these terms and ideas and themes should genuinely inform and help us to know how to leave. Leading a church is difficult. Followers are having a difficult time in this season, but also leaders are as well. And through it all, I would just encourage you to be gracious. Again, if there's overt error theologically or overt sin, then do what you have to do and discharge your conscience. But if it's just a matter of preference, how can you leave in such a way that the unity of the church is protected and the welfare of the bride of Christ is prioritized? And so just that. If you're going to leave a church or you're thinking about leaving a church, in the process of that, put forward, again, a priority over what's important to him, according to the Bible, about a church instead of your preferences, number one. Number two, think of your followership instead of being critical of leadership. And number three, think of the most gracious and merciful way that you can do that instead of a way that would be disruptive or dismissive. For the Clarity Crew, I'm Kurt Gebhards. Be encouraged, be challenged, be clear.